Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some birthday themed cards using the new Birthday Bash collection from Simon Hurley and Spellbinders. This is a beautiful birthday themed collection, but you could also use it for other celebrations as well. There's the Mylar Balloons die set, as well as a Party Balloons 3D embossing folder and coordinating layer stencil set. And then there's two embossing folders that are in the collection, but not necessarily party themed. That first one there was called Flourish. This one is called Plaster, and they can be used anytime throughout the year. Look at the gorgeous texture on this Plaster one. And then finally, some birthday sentiments, hot foil plates, which are perfect for adding sentiments to the cards. So to start off, I'm going to do my sentiments and so that I have them completely done. So throughout the video, I can just put them on my cards. I have my glimmer hot foiling system out and it's nice and hot. And to foil those sentiments, I'm using some mini stripe or mini rainbow stripe foil. There is another foil that is rainbow stripe, but it's a little bit bigger stripes. But for these sentiments, I thought the mini stripe one would be fabulous because some of them are going to be a little bit color changing from one color to the other within that same sentiment. And I think that works perfect for the birthday or the party theme. So once I have those sentiments done, I also wanted to do this sprinkled confetti hot foil plate. This is from the Home for the Holidays collection, and I did another card with it using it as a snowy background. But because this is a birthday themed collection, it's going to work perfect to go with those party balloons and create a party themed card. So for that one, I'm using rainbow confetti foil, and it has kind of blotches of color throughout the foil. So it's going to be perfect for this confetti plate. And look at that background. Such a fun background, perfect for a party, for an invitation, for a celebration. Once I have those two foiled, I'm going to also use my solid hot foil plate and then foil that remaining foil. This way it's not going to go to waste. Sometimes I'll save these solid hot foiled pieces for die cutting other elements or for future cards. I also sometimes use them for mats on my cards. For this particular video, I'm going to be using this piece here for some die cutting to create some of those balloons. And then I'm going to do some sentiments that are the positive hot foiling and some that are the negative hot foiling. And I love the fact that I have the choice between the two different ones, so I can pick and choose which ones are going to look best for the card that I'm creating. Off screen, I took the die set that goes with the sentiments to cut out the sentiments and cut out a couple extra of scrap cardstock and glued them behind. So my sentiments are 3 layers deep. It's got the foiled sentiment or the negative foiled sentiment and then 2 layers of cardstock below it in order to make it nice and strong and give it just a touch more dimension. The dies for the sentiments are very easy to match up. I do like to tape them in place to make sure that they're not going to move when I do my die cutting. That one sentiment there, the bottom part of it is just slightly cut off. I did set it to the side. I'm not going to use it in this video. At that point, I wasn't sure if I was going to. I think you could use it on a card if you had something just slightly covering that bottom part of the sentiment where it is missing, but it's not part of the words, so it's possible that it could be used. So I'm not tossing that one away. I am going to put it aside. It may get used in the future and it may not. However, the solid hot foiled version of it, I am going to toss that one away because it's just, you can tell that part of it's cut off and it looks a little bit funny. So with all of those sentiments done, I'm going to have way more sentiments than I need to complete my cards, but I'm going to have a lot of choice. For my first card, I'm using my Ultra Sticky Mat with the Party Balloon embossing folder as well as the layer stencil. But in order to use that embossing folder, I'm going to use the layer stencil first, stencil my image, and then I'm going to match it up in the embossing folder and emboss that background. Now I'm going to use my Cloud9 interference ink pads here. These ones are, in my opinion, magic ink pads that look different on light cardstock than they do on dark. So one of the ways that I like to use them with layering stencils is to take a black ink and just do a little bit of ink blending around the image surface. Then I use a dry clean cloth and wipe that ink off of my stencil, and then I'm going to use one of the Cloud9 interference inks to color in that whole area. This one is the Tropical Paradise Cloud9 ink pad, so you can see the pink part of the ink on the white cardstock. When you tilt it in the light, you'll see the purple interference part that's on top of that black. It's one of those looks that looks fantastic, but you don't necessarily see it when you're looking straight on until you tilt it in the light. And even that pink, when you tilt it in the light, it has a little bit of a shimmer to it from the interference properties of that ink pad. For the second layer stencil, I'm going to start off the exact same way. I'm going to use my black around the outside edges, and then I'm going to use the teal twist interference ink pad. I have some strips of cardstock on my sticky mat. This is just going to help me position my stencil each and every time. There's a notch on the stencil, and I'm using that in the top left corner of my cardstock, but I want to make sure that I have that stencil on totally straight. And my piece of cardstock that I'm stenciling on here is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, so it's smaller than the image from that stencil, and I didn't want a chance that I was going to have it crooked a little bit and not be able to match it up properly with the embossing folder. By doing this, those little pieces of cardstock stick nicely to the mat and give me a great guide to know that I'm doing it perfectly and everything is all nice and lined up. If I get ink on them, it's no big deal. They're just scrap pieces of cardstock. These interference inks will wipe off really easy off, or clean off really easy off your stencils. I just rinse them under a tap with warm water and they wash right off. There's no cleaner needed or anything, so they do come off really easily. I do, however, have an ink blending brush for each one of the colors of pads because each color has a different color for the light as well as for the interference, and I don't want to mix those up. So I have an ink blending brush for each one of them. I use a label maker just to label on each brush which ink pad it's for, and it works for me. If that didn't work for you, because these inks wash off so easily, after you're done using the inks, you could easily wash off your brushes, let them dry completely before using them in a different pad. That would work as well. This third color here that I'm using is Magic Garden. So we're going to have some pink, some blue, and some green balloons here, but with different interference properties that you're going to see in the light. The last stencil is the highlight part of the balloon, and I'm going to use my white pigment ink pad, but I want to make sure that I'm not going to accidentally contaminate my ink pad by lifting up a little bit of ink. So I just smushed it on my working surface here, and I'm using a detailed ink blending brush just to get all those little areas of that stencil. A detailed brush is going to work so much easier than a larger ink brush here, and I can really make sure that I have good coverage in each one of those channels. Once I'm done the first layer, I can let it dry and go in a second time. I didn't really find that it was necessary. I'm not looking for white areas here. I'm just looking for areas where it lightens the ink color that is below it, and it does that just perfectly, just adding a little bit of an extra highlight. You could also, after doing your ink or your white inking on here, I think it would be fun also to just do a layer of some glossy texture paste and just get a glossy shine there as well. I think that would be fun as well. But I'm not doing that for this card, mainly because I didn't want to wait for drying time. I wanted to continue to create, and I knew with my energy level that if I stopped, it was going to be hard for me to start back up again. So I wanted to get them done, but I just wanted to share that idea with you. If you wanted to make your highlight there shiny, texture paste would work. You could also, once your card is done, you could take a little bit of glossy accents and go over that white area with glossy accents and get a shiny part there as well. So there is my background. Now to line it up with the embossing folder is very easy. There are lines in the embossing folder that show the inside part of the balloon as well as the outside part of the mylar kind of ruffle. So I match those up, and then I use a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to hold it in place. I want to make sure that it's not going to move on me. And I'm using my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine and using the stacking for embossing with a 3D embossing folder. Normally, I mist my cardstock before putting it through an embossing folder, but once again, I didn't want to wait for it to dry, and I also didn't want to put any moisture on the front of that card and have those inks bleed. So I just put it in dry, and you can see I get a beautiful embossed image here, and it adds so much texture to those balloons. I love that background with that embossed texture. So this piece of cardstock was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm cutting it down to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. I wanted to keep as much of that balloon background as possible, but still wanted to see a mat around the edges for my card base. And for my card base, I'm using Teal Topaz cardstock from Spellbinders. So it's going to blend in beautifully with these balloons and works perfectly for a celebration themed card. To glue my embossed background down, I'm using some Barely Art glue with a fine tip bottle. This way I can get as much or as little glue as I need there, and I'm making sure to put a lot of glue on the recessed area that's going to have contact with my card base. I want to make sure that it gets glued in place really, really well. And to finish this card off, all I need is a sentiment. I like to put an acrylic block on my cards while they're drying, hold everything in place, free up my hands, and it also works perfectly for picking sentiments like this. While it's drying, I can lay things on top and see how I like them, and then choose which sentiment I want on there. And you can see how quickly we have a celebration or party themed card. Now, I used a generic color scheme here, but you can customize it to whoever you're creating it for and use any color balloons for this. I think it would be so fun. For my second card, I'm going to use that texture or that plaster embossing folder, and I want to ink my embossing folder before putting it through my die cutting machine, but I couldn't because of the texture on this one. Normally you can tell really easily which is the background and which is not, but this one it was very difficult. So I just grabbed another embossing folder and lined up the writing side with the writing side on this one to figure out which way it was supposed to go. So I'm using some black soot distress ink, and I'm just going to ink my embossing folder, close it on my cardstock, and then run it through my embossing machine. I do have my cardstock taped in place to make sure that it's going to stay where I have embossed it, and I don't have to match that up or worry about that moving on me. I'm going to use some solar paste for this background, and just like those interference ink, solar paste looks different on black than it does on white, and I wanted to showcase that with the background by having the black and the white already there. That way I can just put my solar paste down and you can see how it looks. You can see a bit of color on the black, but on the white you don't see any color until you tilt it in the light. I'm using 3 different colors here. I have Cross My Heart, which is the pink, Beluga, which is the blue, and Crocodile Tears, which is the green. So similar colors to the first card. I'm just using my fingers to spread it on my background. If you don't want to do this, you could use a brush if you wanted to. Fingers are just easier to clean up, easier to control, and I can get them in all the nooks and crannies, and I don't have to worry about brush strokes if I don't want to see them in there. So I'm using a different finger for each one. What I could do if I wanted was use a damp cloth and clean off my fingers and then use the same one for each one of them. I don't want to contaminate my paste, and by using 3 different fingers, it just worked a lot quicker. But if that's something that you don't necessarily want to do, you can easily just clean off your fingers each time. It does dry fairly quick because I'm doing a fairly thin layer here. I'm just doing enough to spread some color and shine throughout that background. I'm not doing a really thick layer on here. For my balloons for the front of the card, I'm going to do a similar technique with this as my first one, but instead of using that layering stencil, I'm using the die cuts from the Mylar balloon die cut set, and I have them die cut with white cardstock, and I'm just using that black pad to do a little bit of black ink blending around them, and then I will use that solar paste to color those balloons in different colors. I'm using my Ultra Sticky Mat once again, and the ink does stain the Ultra Sticky Mat sometimes, but it wipes off and it doesn't affect the use of that mat at all. Now, I could use that mat to also put my paste on, but I don't want to have to clean the paste off of the mat. So I'm just taking my die cuts, holding them in my left hand and spreading the ink on them with my right hand, and it works perfectly. This way I don't have to clean off a surface either. So I'm using each of those colors on a different balloon, so I'll end up with 3 different balloons. You do want to make sure to turn the die cut in your hand when you're doing this, because where your fingers are, you're going to miss a little bit of paste. So by turning it in your hand, you can go in those areas that get missed or that your fingers block. So once again, this doesn't take very, very long to dry because it's a very thin layer of the paste. So I want to say maybe 5 minutes at the most. It really wasn't that long, but I also didn't time it. That background, when I embossed it, was 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, but because I taped it in place, I definitely want to cut this down in order to put it on my card background and tape off those areas that got missed with the paste and with the ink because of that tape. So I cut it down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 so that I have just a little border. Now, I don't normally do a background and the main element with the same technique, but I wanted to show off the background using those solar paste as well as the balloons using them. So this might be a little bit busy for some. To break it up, I used a white die cut for the background of the balloons so that they showed up on that background. But if this is too busy for you, you could use just that background and then solid colored balloons, or you could use the balloons like this and just have that background without any ink or any paste on it, and that is also an option. Like I said, I wanted to show a similar technique on both the balloons and on the background, and I already had many cards planned for this video and didn't want to make this video longer than it needed to be. It was going to be a little bit longer anyways. So I combined the techniques on the same card, but you have options. You can use just the balloon technique on a card or just the background technique on a card, and you'd have some really cool looking results. So I glued down the strings for the balloons just to know exactly where those positions were, but I did lay those balloons down to give me an idea where to lay those strings to have the bottom part or that little knot part of the balloon line up with where the string was. I'm gluing down the white background first and then gluing down my inked and pasted front element to that balloon. And I really love the look of those balloons with the ink blending around the outside and then the light color on the inside. It gives it a little bit more of a visual dimension look. Once I have these all glued down, I can put my acrylic block on there to hold it in place, and I can choose my sentiment. There's also tiny little strings that hang from the balloons from where the knots would be. So I just tuck those in underneath that little lip from the knot. I used my Barely Art glue once again with that fine tip, and for these really thin strings, it works really well for putting just a tiny little bit of glue on there and not getting too much. So I love this bottle with the glue in it for so many different things. So there is that final card, and I love when you tilt it in the light, you get a little bit more of each one of those colors. Right on, head on, it looks more just black and white, but then you get the surprise of the colors to it. For card 3, I'm going to use some Lunar paste with this one. Now, rather than do the same technique as the last one, I am going to take a piece of cardstock. This piece is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and I'm just going to rub the Lunar paste on it and then let it dry. Once again, I have 3 different colors here. That pink was Prom Queen, this blue is Clear Skies, and then I'm also using green, which is Later Gator. I'm just using all of them on the same piece of cardstock. I'm going to die cut the center part of my balloons out of this, so I don't need a huge amount for each piece. This could also be used for a mat for the background to go around the embossed background if you wanted to incorporate it there as well. But for this one, I'm only using it to create a piece of cardstock and die cut it. You could also use this technique or this paste with a very similar technique as the last card, except you wouldn't need to do any ink blending with the black because these Lunar pastes are different from the solar paste. They just have color. They don't have the interference properties that the solar paste has. So it has a completely different look to it. It's more of a bright colored, tiny bit metallic look to it. But they're definitely fun to play with. And these are also so fun to play with stencil backgrounds as well. Now, once I have my background dried here, I'm going to put my dies on it and I'm going to tape them in place before I do my die cutting. I want to make sure that those die cuts are in certain sections of that background so that I get 3 different colored balloons and that I am not having them shift on me while I'm doing my die cutting. So I did the Flourish embossing folder for this one, but I didn't do any ink blending on it. It's just going to add some texture to that background, not any color to that background. So this one's going to be a little bit more subtle than the last card. I have a blue card base here, and my embossed background is also cut to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So it just has just a tiny little rim around it. For the back part of my balloons, I die cut them out of some brushed silver cardstock from the Silver Treasured cardstock package. These are different specialty cardstock packages from Spellbinders. They come in 3 color tones. There's gold, there's silver, and there's rose gold. They have 15 sheets in each one of those packages and 5 different cardstock finishes. So it's a great way to use or to get specialty cardstocks for your holiday cards and even your cards throughout the year, because it works perfectly with this Mylar Balloons die set. I absolutely love that silver outline there, and I love the fact that there's many different finishes to choose from. So you can pick and choose what's going to work best for what you're doing. I love them for holiday cards, but you don't need to necessarily just stick with that. For this card, I'm using just black cardstock for my strings. I wanted to make sure that they were going to show up on my background. You could also use the same silver that you used to die cut the background of the balloons. I chose to just do black because I didn't think the strings were as important as the balloon part. And I thought black was nice and neutral enough to go on that background. I'm doing a tiny little different arrangement with my balloons for this one. The other ones I had the other one I had my strings crossing. This one they're just kind of going down straight. And as I glue each one down, I'm putting that acrylic block on there to hold it in place once again. It just gives everything good contact while it's drying. That pink one, I should have put my string down just a tiny little bit more so it had a little bit more hanging down from it, but that's okay. Now I'm going to glue down those tiny little strings at the bottom of the balloon, and then I will add a sentiment to my card. And you can see how it's coming in really handy to have all of my sentiments done and just be able to pick and choose from what is done to customize it to go with whatever the card is. And by using that mini stripe rainbow foil, I have lots of colors to choose from. So I'm not stuck with just one color for all of the cards. And it creates a really fun celebratory look to them as well. And I love the fact that some of them have a little bit of an ombre look to them. It works perfect for this. So here is the final card, a simpler design than the last one with more of a plain background with just texture, but I love the look of it as well. My next card is going to be using that sprinkled confetti foiled background, but before I do that, I'm just going to do a quick ink blended background. This is going to be for my 5th card, but I want to give it some time to dry, and I figured I might as well let it dry while I'm working on card 4. So for this background, I'm using Mixed Media Heavy Stock, and I am using 3 different distress pad colors. It is Picked Raspberry, Peacock Feathers, and Twisted Citron, nice and bright. Again, similar colors to the colors I've been using with the rest of the cards. I wanted the colors to be similar, but I wanted the techniques to be different so that you can see many different ways to use this collection. But I always like to use similar colors so that the cards kind of coordinate-ish together and they look nice together because they're all made within the same video. So I am using my Ultra Sticky Mat here to hold my cardstock in place. It just frees up my hands, and I'm also using some large ink blending brushes. It covers the area a lot quicker. I definitely need to re-ink my pads though, because that Peacock Feathers one is looking a little bit dry and definitely could use a little bit more ink. So one of these backgrounds I'm going to leave as is with just that Distress ink, and I'm going to do some die cutting with it. The other one, I'm going to use my Distress Spritz sprays, and I'm going to use it in the same colors as my background. So I'm using Peacock Feathers, Picked Raspberry, and Twisted Citron. And that's just going to give a little bit of extra shimmer, which is going to look fantastic for those balloons. So I do have another video where I'm using these Distress Spritzes if you want to see them a little bit more. It's a few videos before this, but they're essentially clear liquid, but they have colored mica in them. So they don't have color in the actual spray itself. It's the mica that has the color, and that's going to really make it shimmer. You could also use this on a plain background, and then it's not going to look like it has a ton of color depending on how much you use until you tilt it in the light, and then you'll see that mica shimmer to it. So for this foiled card, I did all my die cutting off screen as well. I'm using a blue card base, and I'm cutting my foiled confetti background to, once again, 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. I'm really liking the look of this with just the thin borders. So I've just been doing that a lot lately, but you can cut it down however much you like. I love this party background, and this is another one that may be a little bit busier visually than you would like, but you could once again either do this foiled background with some solid color balloons, or do these balloons with a solid color background if you wanted to change it up. I did them in the same card once again for the same reason as my solar paste one. I wanted to show the techniques, but I didn't want to make an extra card and make this video longer than it needed, and figured this would get the info out just as well. So for this one, I'm going to add a little bit of texture to those balloons by taping it or matching them with the balloons in the embossing folder, taping them in place and putting them through my embossing machine. I did the same brushed silver cardstock for my balloon backgrounds, and then I did the solid hot foiled confetti paper for cardstock for the inside part of the balloons. So the solid silver on the outside gives it a little bit of a break from the background, and these really look like Mylar balloons when they're done because of that metallic foil. And this is the first one where I did emboss the balloons, and it really takes it up to the next level. So if you want to add a little bit of extra texture to those balloons, by putting it in that embossing folder, it's really going to enhance it, and it makes them look even more 3D. I absolutely love the look of them. So same as the cards before this, I'm gluing the solid piece on first and then gluing the inside piece. I once again had kind of put my strings where I figured those balloons were going to go. And you can see as I'm adding those balloons how it is a little bit on the busy side. So to take that down, like I just said, you could have this balloon cluster on a solid background, or have this background with some solid colored balloons to still have that beautiful celebration theme to it, but just tone it down a little bit if you want. I love it the way it is, but depending on the occasion and depending on the person, it might be a little bit too busy, and that's totally fine. Once I have those balloons in place, I just glued down the tiny little strings off of the knot, chose my sentiment, and then added it to the front of the card. And because the foil colors are very similar, it works perfect with those foiled sentiments. You can see that dimension when you tilt that into the light. With that card done, off screen, I did my die cutting for this one here. So I used the outside part of the balloon die cut with my distressed background that did not have this distressed spritz sprayed on it. And I used the distressed spritz background with the inner part of the balloon. So the outer part of the balloon is not going to have any shimmer to it, but the inner part is. I chose that one because I figured you're going to see more area of the inner one, and I wanted to show off that spritz background. This here is a background stamp from Spellbinders and Stampendous. I did a video on this earlier. If you want to see this used in a different way, it'll be in that video. And that video, I'm using a bunch of different background stamps from Stampendous, as well as using different distress spritz techniques. So this one, this background comes in 3 different pieces. I wanted to do a horizontal card just for something a little bit different from the cards that I've done for the rest of this video. But I positioned this in my MISTI a little bit too high. That stamp is just above the edge. I didn't think it was that high when I put it in. So I'm just flipping my cardstock over. I am taping it in place because the top piece of that cardstock is wanting to flip up and I don't want to mess up my stamped image. So I just put my paper on there, taped it in place, and then just shifted that stamp down a little bit. It's going to cover most of the background, so the positioning isn't super important because it's just a stamped background. And I'm using 2 different colors from the balloons just so that the colors in the background are different from the balloons. So I'm using carved pumpkin as well as mustard seed for these streamers. You could do a solid color with the streamers as well, but I thought the two-tone blended well with the two-tone of each one of those balloons. And if you notice, when I colored when I die cut those balloons, I die cut them over the ink transition so they have a bit of an ombre look to them. When I put my ink on my stamp, I'm using a blending brush just to buffer that ink, just to make sure I don't have any harsh lines. And I'm doing each one of those colors twice to get a nice solid background. If you wanted it a little bit more subtle, you could just do it one time, but I found that stamping it twice gave it a little bit better coverage. Because I'm just using distress inks for this, I can just use a damp cloth to clean off that stamp and get rid of any of that ink and make sure that it's ready for the next time that I use it. That background is also die cut to, or cut down, trimmed down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. So once again, I have just a tiny little bit of my card base showing. Glued that down, and then I can position my balloons here. Only thing that I would change in the future for the balloons is I would choose an extra color, a fourth color, so that I had a different transition, so I could do 3 different ombre balloons rather than having 2 that are kind of very similar to each other in color tone. But by separating them with that pink heart in the middle, I think it looks just fine. It's just one of those personal preference things. And it's one of those things that I didn't think of till afterwards, because to be honest, when I was doing those ink blended backgrounds, I was going to do solid color balloons. But when I was positioning my dies, I thought it would look really, really cool to have ombre balloons, something a little bit different. So sometimes in the middle of a project, plans change, and I didn't want to stop and redo my ink blending backgrounds to create another one, and to also have to wait for some sprayed back or the distress spritz to dry again. So this works totally fine, but personal preference, I would like the balloon to be a different color. Again, personal preference, not that big of a deal. You still get the idea from this. And I love the streamer background in contrast with the balloons. It really gives an even more celebratory feeling. Once again, I can pick and choose which sentiment is going to work the best. And all of these sentiments are going to work perfectly with the party, the celebration theme. So I love the fact that there's lots of choice there by doing that foiling in the rainbow stripe. When I glued my strings down, I had them going off the edge, so I can just trim those down to make them even with the edge. And we have our finished card here. This one done with distress inks and distress spritz. Then we have our foiled background. Once again, a little bit busy, but you could separate that into 2 cards very easily. We have our lunar paste background as well as our solar paste, which again, if that's too busy, you can separate it into 2 cards very easily, but I love the effect that gives. And then my favorite Cloud9 interference pads, because I love the way that they look with that dark and the light. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you were inspired with all the birthday celebration cards from this collection. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate you being here. Have a fantastic day.